I have lived in Fallow Creek for 31 years. I have set broken bones and pulled bullets and sat with the dying in this town longer than most of its residents have been alive, and I will tell you plainly, I have never seen a crowd of grown men find so much to study in their boot leather as the morning Harlan Goff's crew put a torch to Morrisell's millinery shop. It was not yet 7 o'clock. The smoke was still climbing when I came out of my office, and half the town was already standing in the road watching it go. Nobody moved toward the bucket line. Nobody called out to Goff's men, who leaned against their horses with their arms crossed and let the fire do what they'd sent it to do. Mora stood on the far side of the street in her gray morning dress with her hands folded in front of her, watching 8 years of work turn to cinder, and her face was so still it looked carved. She had seen something 3 weeks prior that Harlan Goff did not want seen. That was the sum of it. Goff's enforcer, a man called Breed Taro, had shot a sheep rancher named Cole in the alley behind the feed store over a boundary dispute Goff had manufactured, and Mora had been at her back window cutting ribbon when it happened. She'd told me about it that same evening, quiet and exact, the way she did everything. She'd told the sheriff the following morning. The sheriff had ridden out to the Goff property, come back by noon, and told her she must have been mistaken about what she saw. 3 days later her front window was broken. A week after that, a note was pushed under her door that said 2 words, "Leave town." She had not left town. That was the kind of woman Morrisell was. So Goff escalated. And on a Tuesday morning in October, Fallow Creek stood in the road and watched, and I stood with them, and not one of us did a thing worth speaking of. That was when I first noticed the stranger. He was leaning against the post of the harness shop with his arms crossed and his head tilted against the early sun, and he'd been there long enough that I couldn't say when he'd arrived. Lean man, trail-worn, maybe 40. A duster the color of creek mud, boots that had seen 3 territories. He had the kind of stillness you learn to recognize in a man who has spent years staying alive in situations where moving too fast gets you killed. I had not seen him before, and Fallow Creek is a small enough town that I knew most faces. He was watching Mora, not the fire. Goff's men finished their business in the way men like that always do, slow and deliberate, making sure everyone understood who the lesson was for. Breed Taro himself was there, the enforcer, a broad-shouldered man in a good hat who carried a rifle like a walking stick. When the roof of the millinery collapsed and the crowd let out a collective breath, Taro pushed off his horse and walked across the road toward Mora. "You've had your warning," he said, loud enough for the street to hear. "Coach to Denniston leaves Thursday morning. Be on it." Mora looked at him the way you'd look at a fence post. "Mr. Taro," she said, "I have a business license from the territorial office, a deed to that lot, and 8 years of accounts in the Fallow Creek Savings Institution. I am not getting on any coach." Taro reached out and took her by the arm. That was when the stranger came off the post. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He just walked, and something in the pace of it made 2 of Goff's other men straighten up without being told. He stopped 6 feet from Taro with his hands loose at his sides and said, very quietly, "Not another step." Taro turned. "Who in the—" He looked at the stranger's face, and something changed in his expression. Not fear exactly. Something adjacent to it. "I'm just passing through," the stranger said. "But I don't pass through that." He nodded at the hand Taro still had on Mora's arm. There was a long moment. I have thought about that moment many times since. Half a dozen armed men, a crowd of 30-odd souls who had done nothing all morning, and one lean drifter standing in the road with the sun behind him and nothing in his hands. What tipped it, I still can't say with certainty. Maybe it was the stillness. Maybe it was something in the set of his jaw, or the fact that he hadn't gone for iron, which told Taro this was not a man who needed to. Maybe Taro simply recognized a particular kind of man and decided the arithmetic was wrong. Whatever it was, Taro let go of her arm. He said something low and ugly that I won't repeat here, and he walked back to his horse. His men followed. They rode north out of town, which was the direction of the Goff property, and the crowd that had watched Mora's shop burn began, slowly and with what I can only call shame, to disperse. Mora turned to the stranger. She looked at him for a moment, measuring, the way she measured everything. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said. And that was all. His name, I learned over the next few days, was Doc Krell. He had ridden up from the south, work scarce, and had been meaning to push on to the mining country before winter set in. He took a room at the Fallow Creek boarding house and ate his meals quietly and did not speak much to anyone. What reputation preceded him, and some did, drifting in on the mouths of two freighters who recognized him, was the kind that made men step careful. He had hired his gun in younger years, I gathered, for people who sometimes deserved the help and sometimes didn't, and somewhere along that road he had arrived at a set of principles that had cost him more than they'd earned him. He didn't elaborate on this. It was the sheriff, nervous as a cat on a tin roof, who told me what little he knew, mostly as a way of deciding whether Krell was a problem for him. I told the sheriff the problem for him was Harlan Goff. Mora had not left her lot. The morning after the fire, before the ash was cold, she was out there with a broom sweeping the scorched timber into a pile. 3 women from the Methodist congregation came to help her, which I thought was courage on their part, and 2 didn't. She had salvaged her account books from the small iron safe that had survived, and she was already pricing lumber. I watched her from my office window and thought that I had known this woman for 9 years as a neighbor and a patient, and I still did not fully understand what she was made of. Krell appeared at her lot mid-morning. He didn't ask. He picked up the other broom and started sweeping. She looked at him once. She didn't tell him to stop. They worked 3 days like that, clearing the lot, stacking salvage, and I watched what Fallow Creek does when it is ashamed of itself, which is to gradually, quietly, begin to help. By the 3rd afternoon there were 4 men helping stack lumber who had stood in the road and watched the fire, and they worked without speaking much because there wasn't anything to say. On the 4th day, Harlan Goff came to town himself. Goff was not a man who did his own dirty work as a rule, but something had shifted. Maybe it was the sight of that lot getting cleared. Maybe it was the quiet presence of Doc Krell, whose name had apparently made its way back to the Goff property in a way that hadn't settled well. Whatever the cause, Goff rode in on a Thursday afternoon with Taro and 4 riders, and he stopped in front of the scorched lot where Mora was measuring the foundation line and Krell was holding the other end of the rope. "Mrs. Sell," Goff said. He was a large man, well dressed in the way of men who use their money as an argument. "I'm going to make you one final offer for this property. What you saw in that alley was a misunderstanding. Cole drew first. If you'll sign over the deed and take the coach Thursday, I'll pay you twice the assessed value, and we'll call it settled." Mora let her end of the rope down and straightened up and looked at him. "Cole didn't draw first," she said. "He was reaching for the fence post to steady himself when your men shot him. He was trying to stand up straight. I was 12 feet away and I had good light and I know what I saw." The street had gone quiet. There were people on both sides of the road, more than you'd expect at that hour, and I understood they had been drifting in for the past quarter hour because word travels fast in a small town and people had known this was coming. "That's a serious accusation," Goff said. "I wrote it down the same evening," Mora said. "The account is at my bank in a sealed envelope with instructions. If anything happens to me, it goes to the territorial marshal. I told your Montero that 2 weeks ago and I'll tell you now." I saw something flicker across Goff's face. He hadn't known about the envelope. He looked then at Krell, who was standing to Mora's left with his arms at his sides and no expression on his face. "You have no stake in this," Goff said to him. "I've got a stake in what I can see with my eyes," Krell said. "A woman tried to do right by a dead man and you burned her shop for it. That's what happened here." He said it the same way he said everything, level, not loud. "And there are enough people on this road right now who know it that you're not going to be able to make the story come out different." That was the moment. Not the fire, not the standoff with Taro, this was the moment when Fallow Creek, which had been holding its breath for 3 weeks, made up its mind. One of the men who'd helped clear the lot that week stepped off the boardwalk and stood in the road. Then a woman from the dry goods store. Then the Methodist preacher, who had not struck me previously as a particularly brave man, came and stood beside him. Goff sat on his horse for a long time looking at the town. Then he turned and rode north, and Taro rode with him, and the 4 riders followed, and that was the last time Harlan Goff came to Fallow Creek in the way of a man who owned it. The territorial marshal arrived 6 weeks later, summoned by a letter the sheriff had finally found the spine to send, and the matter of Breed Taro and the sheep rancher named Cole was settled the following spring in a territorial court in a city I won't name here. Goff lost 2 properties and a good portion of what he'd taken from boundary disputes across 6 years, and Taro answered for what he'd done in that alley. Mora's new shop opened in February. I attended the opening with most of the rest of the town. She had a sign painted, simple block letters, white on green, and a small bell above the door that rang when you came in. The place smelled of fresh lumber and hat ribbon and beeswax, and she stood behind the counter in a blue dress I had not seen before and shook hands with every soul who came through the door. Doc Krell had stayed through the winter. He'd worked the livery and done some fence work for a rancher north of town and not spoken much about plans. People had begun to simply accept him the way you accept a piece of furniture that turns out to have been in the right spot all along. The morning after the opening, I passed the shop before my first appointment and saw through the window that Mora had a pot of coffee on the little stove she'd installed in the back corner, and Krell was sitting on a stool at the counter with a cup in his hands, and they were talking. Not about anything I could hear. Just talking. She was measuring something, ribbon or cord, I couldn't say, and he was watching her work with an expression I recognized because I have seen it before in men who have spent a very long time arriving somewhere. I found out later, she told me herself, some years afterward, in the matter-of-fact way she told everything, that what she'd said to him that morning was simply, "Do you have somewhere you need to be?" And he had thought about it, she said, for a long time. Long enough that she'd gone back to her measuring and assumed the conversation was over. Then he'd said, "Not anymore, I don't think. There's not much else to tell." They wed the following autumn. He still had that duster, though it was newer by then, and on the morning of the ceremony he came in with a single late-blooming prairie rose from somewhere out on the flats, I never knew where he found it that late in the year, and set it on the counter beside her gloves without a word. I have been a doctor in Fallow Creek a long time. I have seen men do large, showy things to prove themselves, and I have seen men do small, quiet things that turn out to matter more. Doc Krell stepped into a road when every other man in town had found reasons not to, and he swept ash for 3 days without being asked, and he said what was true out loud in front of people who needed to hear it. That is the whole of what he did. It was enough. More than enough. And that town, my town, has been better for it ever since.